In South African legislation, the state is mandated to provide services to assist women who are victims of abuse. But in reality, implementation of these services is slow, inconsistent, and sometimes non-existent. Women's abuse shelters are one of the services that have been found to be the most effective in disrupting the cycle of domestic violence.
So shelters disrupt violence perpetrated against women and children. How do you do that?
If you look at the concept itself, it is a place of safety. So when a woman needs to escape the violence, when she's at the point where she's ready to leave, because we must also understand the cycle of violence as well. It is a psychological trauma as well to be trapped in a cycle of violence. So when you're coming to the shelter, you are attempting to break that cycle. And when you are with us, part of what we do is education. Part of what we do is to also share with you what violence is and what are your options available, so that then you can make your decision. How do you carry on forward from there? And I think that is how we disrupt violence in that space, where she's now in a safe space. She's given time to heal. She's also being educated about her rights and also looking at her strengths and allowing her to develop her own agency. And then I think in that way we disrupt violence.
Kwigame yokugqibela ndinayo ipiki phaa efowunini wandibetha ngayo ngentsimbi ngespare ntoni laa nto yokhulisa imoto wandibetha ngalaa ntsimbi apha, then ndanalaa nto apha, then ndenza i-operation apha ke ngoku eSt Dominus une-medical aid. Ndenzwa i-operation apha kulo mlenze okulicala, then wandikhuphela umpu ke ngoku ndithanga wentloko ukuze kukhale abantwana. Bakhala ke ngoku abantwana. Yonke le nto yenzeka abantwana bekhona. Ndithi ukuze ndisinde ndingadutyulwa ngalo mpu kube kanti kukho abantwana. So ndaphela ke ngoku ndisiza eshelter kuba kaloku ndibaleka ubulawa because uthe uzawundibulala ubekhe ndimdivosa. Ndamdivosa kulo nyaka pheleyo, ndaphinda ndoyichitha idivosi endicenga uba mandichithe le divosi. Ndicenga nabantu basekhaya uba ayikho le nto ndiyenzileyo. Ngoku ndichithile idivosi akatshintshi lo mntu caba ebengafuna ulahlekelwa mhlawumbi. Ndathi ndoyicinga ebengafuna ulahlekelwa, ebefuna into yoba mandichithe le divosi. Ezinye izinto zibe khona iindawo zaziguqula zingabizi yena.
Xa umane uyiripota ezinto emapoliseni bebetrita njani?
Emapoliseni bendiye ngoku ngoba bendilapha eshelter kulo nyaka pheleyo wenzelwa i-protection order. But laa mfana ugqitha ngapha kwe-protection order ngumntu, laa mfana ngumntu ongathi ligitsa. Akho polisa angalaziyo, akanapolisa angalaziyo. Andisho amapolisa arongo, uyaqonda, but arongo ngenye ixesha ngoba uneetshomi izikakhulu zingamapolisa because unomntana wakhe owabamba ngesapoti, but zange laa mntana akwazi uba kanti anganikwa laa mali ngenxa yento yoba esazi umntu ophaa ekhothi oyitshomi yakhe wamvela wamnika imali. Yayibona, wamnika i-7,000 uba akulingi ayinyuse le mali, ungaziphindi inyuse le mali, ayiphelele kule 150. Yayibona, so ibingahambeli indawo into yam, but yahambi wakwazi uhambela ndawo kuba ndiye eScenery Park ndomenzela i-protection order khona, but ebegqitha ngapha kwayo.
While shelters play a critical role in disrupting domestic violence, the current funding model is not adequate to sustain these organizations, with many shelters being funded per bed without taking into account the numerous services necessary to assist survivors of domestic violence to get back on their feet.
If I think of our monthly costs, we are a 15-bed shelter, so that means we can accommodate up to 15 women and their children. And then we have a staff ratio to that. So it would be myself as the shelter manager, we have our full-time social worker, and then we have 4 house mothers, and they work on a 3-day on, 3-day off ratio for 12-hour shifts. and then we also have a cleaner on staff as well. And then part of our costs, because when you come to the shelter, we provide, we try and provide to all your basic needs. So that would be your accommodation, food, should you need clothing, if you need support in terms of getting ID documents, marriage certificates if you want to apply for a divorce, or the children need birth certificates so we can place them in schools. We provide that money, and then also where a lot of the women would go back to their family homes, which are in predominantly rural areas because of where we are in the Eastern Cape, and then we will provide that monetary support as well. And then just looking at our administration costs and everything, for us we're looking at over 100,000 rand a month.
Enhancing state responsiveness to gender-based violence, paying the true costs, was a 3-year research study by the Heinrich Boell Foundation and the National Shelter Movement of South Africa to investigate the role that shelters play in disrupting abuse, to look at what is needed for it to work more effectively, and also interrogate the state's roles and responsibilities in regard to this.
So this project that we call Enhancing the State's Response to Gender-Based Violence, Paying the True Costs, is actually stems from an earlier project which we did between 2011 and 2013, where we were looking at the police's response and the court's response to domestic violence. But there was one particular aspect. For example, the Domestic Violence Act says that the police must refer or try and assist women to access shelters. But there's actually no legislation which talks about now how are those shelters going to exist. There's no mention of funding, for example. So this only exists within policy. The government has a duty to provide shelters, but that also means that if shelters must exist, the services must also be of adequate quality. So we started our research then in Western Cape and Gauteng, and we were trying to see is what are the profile of women and their children accessing shelters, and can those shelters meet those needs within the context of funding by government. So we were finding that government was funding shelters at a unit rate. At the time it was really low. It was at 28 Rand and 30 cents in Western Cape, for example. And there was some funding towards the employment of a social worker and house mothers, etc. But it was really low. And part of the difficulties with government is that they recognize that they need to fund these services, but within the framework of NGOs, they expect NGOs to make up the shortfall. And that's kind of problematic because, I mean, I use this analogy often. If there's a hole in a road and government contracts a service provider to come fill that hole, he won't say you pay, we'll give you 20% of the cost of fixing that hole and you must cover the 80% that is remaining to cover the cost of that. So if that doesn't happen within that kind of context, why is it that NGOs, for example, have to bear the brunt of that in meeting services that are technically government's responsibility? So we can understand, that government can't fund everything. We have so many needs that it is impossible to do so. But if NGOs cannot raise the shortfall, then they cannot deliver the services. And that means we are doing a disservice to victims of violence.